As Reconstruction efforts waned at the federal level in the 1870s, as Jim Crow laws got enacted and the Supreme Court gradually abolished civil rights gained by African Americans in the 1860s and early 1870s, the Episcopal Church's attention turned increasingly to missionary work in the West and among Native Americans, which is going to be our focus next week. In its report in 1877 to the General Convention, the denomination's Board of Missions conceded that most black people in the South were indifferent to the Episcopal Church and that most white Episcopalians were unconcerned in reversing the trend. As a result, in 1878, the Commission of Home Missions to Colored People was formally disbanded and folded into the larger missionary work of the church. Notions of separate and unequal thwarted even the best intentions of general conventions, of conferences, commissions, and plans to reintegrate African Americans into the church. The majority of white Episcopalians simply wanted to be sure that no blacks held or exercised power in their parishes or their dioceses. Debates about the establishment of separate racial districts surfaced repeatedly well into the 1940s, so that black congregations were racially segregated. Let me rephrase that. Congregations were racially segregated. There were white congregations and black congregations. There were few biracial congregations after the war. Black congregations had no real representation at diocesan conventions. They weren't seated as full, equal members with voice and vote. And even though African American suffragan, that is, assistant bishops, were elected by white delegates and consecrated, they were always under the tutelage of a white bishop, and in the eyes of many, the black suffragans had been co-opted by the white episcopacy. Something interesting happened with the outbreak of World War II. It unleashed a number of social changes. The draft transferred many Southern black men away from their rural homes. Nearly 500,000 African Americans left the South after the First World War broke out and moved to urban areas in the Northeast and Midwest. For these African Americans, the Great Migration from the South not only represented an experience akin to emancipation after the Civil War, but it encouraged the emergence of a new militancy about race. The economic base for black-owned businesses, professions, and religious institutions broadened considerably as the number of residents in areas like Harlem grew rapidly in the early 20th century. And also you found that because of the prosperity during the wartime in terms of industry in America and the lack of white males to participate in industry because they were off at war, many blacks were hired by business and industry during the First World War, and their social status increased. The results for the Episcopal Church were grim. By 1933, over 50% of all urban black churches were Baptist. 17% were Methodist. 16% belonged to holiness groups. Less than 2% were Episcopal. Outside of the city, the situation was even worse. Less than 1% of all rural black churches were affiliated with the Episcopal Church. In the South, black Episcopal membership continued to decline, as you might have expected. I know these two lecture segments have been rather bleak, but I think these reminders are important. Racism and paternalism cast long shadows in our denomination. Redress has been slow in coming. That's why we need to recover the memory of people like Julia Cooper and Crummell. That's why we need pages devoted to their work in Holy Women, Holy Men. But it also reminds us, too, of the distinctions that still continue in our church. For example, we have a supplement to the hymnal, Lift Every Voice, which is an attempt to pay respect to African American hymnody and to musical traditions in the African American church. But it is a supplement. It's interesting, when the hymnal 1982 was being planned, we commissioned all sorts of high art European and American music to be included in that hymnal, and yet it was only as an afterthought that we compiled an African American hymnal. That seems good, but it still seems as something separate, something mainstream, something that can be considered optional. Parishes like in Denver, St. Thomas Episcopal Church, where Laura is working, has Lift Every Voice right next to the hymnal 1982 in the pews, and it's used every week, and parts of their worship service include aspects of the African American tradition, and that, by the way, is a biracial parish par excellence. But they include those traditions seamlessly in worship, and one wonders if we have to recognize that the inclusion of African Americans and other minority groups within our tradition has to be more intentionally mainstream than we have done in the past, if we're ever to achieve that kind of redress that I've been talking about in my comments during these two lectures.